ARMA 3 has a lot of different campaigns. One of them is Remnants of War, which was released as part of the Laws of War DLC. While playing it, there was one thing that stood out to me in particular, and that was how the temporal structure of the plot was effectively used as a storytelling device. I think part of the reason why the Remnants of War campaign is held in such high esteem among many members of the ARMA 3 community has to do with this temporal structure. After all, the story could also have been presented in a simple, straightforward chronological order, like other ARMA 3 campaigns, but instead the developers opted for a more achronological approach where we frequently jump forth and back in time over the course of the campaign. So in this video I want to take a closer look at some of these temporal structures and examine some of the functions they serve.
Identified from afar, presumably by these special forces at the castle. Once they had a handle on what...
For those of you who don't know the story, here is a short summary. Civil war broke out on the island of Altis, and the village of Orio Castro became a guerrilla stronghold and an important symbol of the resistance. During this time, NGO worker Nathan McDade and others were locally providing humanitarian aid and got to know the village and the local people there. When the fighting between local guerrillas and government forces escalated, they had to pull out. Soon afterwards, a cluster bomb was dropped on the village and killed most resistance fighters and almost all civilians. In the aftermath of the bomb strike, government forces broke through the weakened resistance defenses and recaptured the village. Months later, Nathan and his co-workers returned to Orio Castro. At this point, the village is a ghost town. We, the player, take control of Nathan and are tasked to help remove all leftover armed mines in the area. They are the eponymous Remnants of War. While we're working on demining the area, an investigative journalist interviews Nathan on the phone to find out more about the conflict between resistance and government forces, and possible violations of the laws of war. Nathan is happy to tell her what he knows. Many of the events and memories he recounts take the form of flashbacks. In some of those flashbacks, we reenact and relive portions of other people's lives towards the end of the Civil War. We take on multiple roles, including one as a resistance fighter, a civilian, and government and NATO operatives, including special ops.
But truth can be the first casualty of war.
Sure, but didn't somebody witness them in action?
From a distance, yeah.
Now let's unpack how Remnants of War arranges these and other events and analyze what effects this particular arrangement has on our play experience. On a very basic level, you could say that the events in the campaign oscillate between the present and the past. We as the player experience a chunk of the story in the present, followed by a flashback taking us into the past. The next chunk takes us back into the present again, then we jump back into another flashback memory, and so on. Probably the most obvious and important function of these time jumps forth and back is that they add suspense. If the story had just been told in chronological order, like I did at the beginning of this video, the story would probably have been at least a little bit less interesting to many players. I'll give you just one example of what I mean. The first mission, where I accidentally trip on a mine, isn't the first mission chronologically speaking, but it's well suited as a first mission because it catches our attention with a bang. With this, the tone for the rest of the campaign is set, and we'll probably want to find out more at this point and continue playing. These time jumps also break up the story into smaller bits and allow for more fine-tuned pacing. While most of the action takes place in flashbacks, most of the more contemplative, less adrenaline-driven play takes place in the present. It would probably be kind of boring to just play through the action bits first and then through the slower bits afterwards, or the other way around. Instead, the campaign divides the present timeline up into smaller chunks and sprinkles in memories that contain more action or exposition. For example, when we get to see Orio Castro as it used to be before all the fighting and bombing. You could also say that the present timeline acts as a persistent hub world that we always return to after a memory ends. The memories of the past are always different. We end up at a different place, as a different character at a different time. The present timeline is always continuous. When we return to it, we play at the same place as before, as the same character, and at the same time. So the present timeline allows players to keep some sense of temporal orientation. The game also displays literal timelines to further help players keep orientated between time jumps. This twofold temporal structure also quite naturally lends itself to introducing all sorts of binary oppositions. In the campaign, different temporalities, so the past and the present, are about very different gameplay experiences. The past is more about faster-paced, linear, more action-oriented gameplay that encourages forward movement. The past fluctuates a lot. The present timeline is more stable. It represents slower, more contemplative, loop-like gameplay that encourages exploration and repetition. The thematic focus is also different. The present is more about the dangers of armed mines that are left behind, the tedium of demining operations, and related ethical considerations. Past events, on the other hand, put more of an emphasis on the bombastic visuals, on the destructive power of mines, and their situational usefulness. So whereas the present is more about contemplation from a distance, looking at leftover mines from a more detached point of view, flashbacks throw us right into the action. They are more personal and more visceral. There's much more drama and trauma that is directly visible. These and other binary oppositions don't just add variety to the gameplay experience, they also help us understand the issue at hand better by presenting different perspectives on the same topic. Jumping between past and present events that are connected allows us to simultaneously be the cause of a hazardous situation and then later experience the consequences of creating exactly that hazardous situation. For example, we order the cluster bomb airstrike on Oreo Castro. We deploy anti-personnel mines around the church or around anti-tank mines so they become difficult to remove. These actions are the reason why there are leftover mines and undetonated bombs all around Oreo Castro in the first place. Then compare that to the slow demining operation in the present, where we have to use a UAV to tediously detonate mines from a distance, or we have to slowly and carefully crawl towards a mine on the dirt to reach one anti-personnel mine at a time. If you think about it, setting up the mines in the past was relatively easy and straightforward. Probably too easy and too straightforward. Now disarming them in the present is very tedious, dangerous, and super slow. On a structural level, the game is telling us that we should be more mindful about our actions because the consequences of them may still be felt for a long time afterwards. There is a second temporal structure I want to just briefly talk about as well. The Remnants of War campaign actually starts and ends with exactly the same event. That is, Marcos Kouris steps on a mine and is blown up. The first time this happens, we can control the character and the incident basically kicks off the whole story and introduces us to the main topic of the campaign, the mines, the literal remnants of war. This scene is disorientating. An unexpected explosion catches us by surprise after all. The second time happens right at the end of the campaign. Control is taken away from us this time and we already know what is going to happen next. The game doesn't even bother to show us the explosion a second time. Instead, it only hints at it by sound. With all the knowledge and background information we have accumulated over the course of the campaign, we're now not caught off guard anymore like at the beginning. The first time this explosion happens, we might mentally go back a few seconds to check if we made a mistake. But here, in the second instance much later, we instead start to anticipate the next few seconds. We now look forward instead of backward, because we already have a pretty good idea at this point what is going to happen. And with that final explosion, we have now come full circle, because the campaign starts and ends with the same explosion. This is a signal or marker on the temporal level that the story has now reached its conclusion. We have now examined two temporal structures and some of the functions they serve. One was the campaign's oscillation between past and present events, the other the campaign's cyclical temporal movement. It would be interesting to explore other temporal structures too. For example, it might be a worthwhile endeavor to look into how the Remnants of War timeline overlaps with the main ARMA 3 campaign East Wind timeline. Instead of just looking at temporal aspects, it might also be interesting to examine the place elements of Oreo Castro and its story functions. Hint: environmental storytelling. Another interesting aspect of the narrative would be story elements that change depending on players' in-game actions and how this affects the gameplay experience. For example, some dialogue lines and the final report by journalist Catherine Bishop change depending on the player's actions during the campaign. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed watching this video and let me know your thoughts on the topic in the comments below.